what if one of the biggest, most foundational beliefs about Jesus was actually based on a misunderstanding? Today, we're going to dive into a question that, depending on how you answer it, could totally flip what you thought you knew about the whole Christian story. So, let's get right to it. Did Jesus exist before his birth in Bethlehem? I mean, was he a conscious being, up in heaven, before he was ever conceived in Mary's womb? For centuries, for most people, the answer has been a pretty solid yes. But what if the biblical evidence actually points in a completely different direction?
Okay, so the ideas we're exploring today come from this book, Firstborn, Exposing the Myth of Preexistence. And what we're going to do is walk through its main argument. It's a direct challenge to that centuries-old tradition, and it does it by taking a really fresh look at the scriptural evidence. All right, so before we can challenge an idea, we have to know what it is, right? Let's talk about the traditional view, this concept that's been a cornerstone of Christian theology for, well, almost 2,000 years.
So the traditional view, the one most of us are familiar with, is that Jesus lived eternally in heaven, he was this divine being, and then at a specific point in history, he kind of stepped into human flesh for his short time on earth. And this is the core idea the book really wants us to rethink.
So how does the book make its case? Well, the heart of the argument is all about re-examining those key scriptures. The proof texts, the verses that have been used for centuries to support this idea of pre-existence. And you can probably guess the first one up. It's maybe the most famous and foundational text for this entire doctrine, the very beginning of John's Gospel. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and the Word became flesh. Okay, so right here is where we hit the first big fork in the road. The traditional take is that the Word is Jesus himself, right? But Firstborn argues something totally different. It says the Logos wasn't a person at all. Instead, it was God's eternal plan, his wisdom or purpose, which was then perfectly brought to life or embodied in the man Jesus.
And everything really hinges on this one Greek word, logos. The book argues that we should think of it less like a person and more like an architect's blueprint. The design that exists before the building is constructed. It represents God's intention, his plan, his wisdom, not a separate, conscious co-builder who is there alongside him.
All right, let's move on to the next big proof text. This one is from Colossians chapter 1, where Jesus is called the firstborn of every creature. Now, on the surface, this is often taken as proof that he was the very first being God ever created. But again, the book asks us to look closer. The argument here is that firstborn isn't about when you were born. It's about your rank and privilege. It doesn't mean the first one in the timeline, but the one with the highest status, the one who gets the primary inheritance over all of creation.
And just like with logos, this all comes down to the original Greek. The word is prototokos. The author argues this term is all about supremacy and even points to other biblical examples like King David. David was the youngest of his brothers, but in Psalm 89, God calls him my firstborn. Why? Not because of his birth order, but because of his exalted rank as king.
Okay, so the last major proof text that the book tackles is from Philippians chapter 2. And the traditional view of pre-existence leans heavily on this idea that Jesus emptied himself.
And this is a big one. The book's take is that this whole passage is about mindset, not metaphysics. So the traditional view says Jesus emptied himself of his divine powers to become human. But the book reinterprets this completely. It says that Jesus, as a human being, simply emptied himself of his own self-interest, his personal rights, and chose the path of a servant instead of trying to grab for status. Okay, so after breaking down those classic texts, the book doesn't just stop there. It starts to build its own positive case for Jesus' origin. It actually calls this his Genesis moment, and it points right to the gospel birth narratives. And where does this positive case begin? Literally the first verse of the New Testament. Matthew's Gospel kicks off with the book of the Genesis of Jesus Christ. And Genesis, well, Genesis means a beginning, an origin. Then you've got Luke's account, which the book says is even more direct. The angel tells Mary that the Holy One is being generated. See that? It's a present, ongoing action. From the book's perspective, this points to an origin that's happening right then and there, not some being who already existed just showing up in a body.
And from there, the author pulls together all this scriptural evidence for what they call his genuine humanity. Think about it. Verses that say he learned obedience through suffering, that he prayed with loud cries and tears, that he grew in wisdom and stature, and, crucially, that he was tempted in every way, just like us.
The argument is that these experiences only really mean something if he was genuinely human, not some divine being just play-acting a human role.
So at this point, you might be thinking, okay, this is interesting, but why does any of this really matter? It's all just deep theology, right? Well, according to the author of this book, the stakes in this debate are actually incredibly high.
Okay, so according to Firstborn, this idea of pre-existence isn't just a minor detail. It creates some pretty big theological problems. For one, how can we really relate to someone if their struggles weren't fully genuine? It kind of risks making his moments of faith feel like a performance, right? Because he'd already know the outcome. And on top of that, the book argues it creates some deep contradictions with the Bible's really strict monotheism by basically suggesting a second divine figure existed alongside God. And this really all gets summed up in a pretty provocative quote from the book, "The pre-existence of Christ makes a mockery of the very life of Christ." Wow. I mean, the core idea there is that a struggle isn't a real struggle, and faith isn't real faith if you already know how it all ends from your own personal past experience.
So if that's the problem, what's the solution? What's the alternative picture that the book paints? Well, it all centers on this idea of Jesus not as a deity who came down, but as the glorified human.
So the book's big conclusion is this: Jesus' glory isn't something he was just reclaiming from a past life. It was something he earned. In this view, he's magnified as the ultimate pioneer, the very first human to achieve immortal glory because of his perfect faith and obedience. He becomes the prototype, the model for what humanity can become.
So look, whether you end up agreeing with the book's argument or not, the challenge it throws down is pretty clear. It really forces us to ask, how does pulling on this one single thread of belief change the entire story of who Jesus is? It's a question that kind of reweaves the whole theological tapestry, and it's definitely one worth thinking about long after this explainer is over.